Chapter 1. A body on the beach. Noise. Headache. Dry mouth. Half asleep, Helen Shepherd turned over in bed, but the noise didn't stop. A moment later, she woke up. The noise. It was her phone. She took it off the table next to her bed. "Yes?" she said. Her dry mouth made it difficult to talk, and her head hurt quite badly. Too much wine last night. "Is that Detective Inspector Shepherd?" asked a voice. "Yes," said Shepherd. "I'm sorry to wake you," said the voice. The voice waited for Shepherd to say something, but she didn't. She looked at the clock. It was 6:30. Well, my name's Webb," said the voice. "Brian Webb. I'm your new sergeant. I start working for you today. Well, this morning, actually. I'm sorry to wake you up, but—" "Sergeant," said Shepherd, "people call me at all times of the day and night. Forget the sorry. Just tell me what the problem is." "There's a body on the beach," said Webb. "In Hythe, about 200 meters from the Grand Hotel. I'm there now." "I'll be 20 minutes," replied Shepherd, and put her phone back down on the table. Shepherd stood under the shower for 5 minutes. The hot water got the blood moving around her tired body. She drank half a liter of water and took 3 aspirins. 5 minutes later, she was in her car. The drive from her house in Folkestone to Hythe took Shepherd less than 10 minutes. It was the beginning of autumn, and small seaside towns like Hythe were becoming quiet again after the busy summer. The school holidays were over, the beaches were almost empty, and this early in the morning there were few cars on the roads. As she came into Hythe, Shepherd passed the Seaview Cafe on her right. It was just opening for breakfast. 200 meters down the road, also on the right, she could see a large building, the Grand Hotel. On her left was the seawall. And on the other side of the wall were the beach and the sea. There were a number of cars by the side of the road. Shepherd stopped behind them. She looked quickly at herself in the car mirror. Gray blonde hair tied back, intelligent eyes, small nose, thin mouth. "I don't look too bad," she thought. But she felt tired and old, and her head still hurt. She got out of her car and looked over the wall. A cold wind was coming off the sea. The sun was just up. About 50 meters along the beach, some people were standing around and looking down at something. The body. One of them, a young man in a blue suit, looked around and saw Shepherd. "That must be Webb," Shepherd thought. "He looks about 16. It was true what people said. As you get older, police officers look younger. Webb came to meet Shepherd as she walked over. "I'm Brian Webb, madam," he said. "Your new sergeant." "I know," said Shepherd. "You know?" asked Webb. "Yes, sergeant," replied Shepherd. She waved a hand at the others. "You're the only person here I don't know, so you must be my new sergeant. I'm a detective, remember." "Oh," said Webb, looking down and then up again. Shepherd looked him in the eye. "And don't call me madam," she said. "It's Shep. That's what everyone calls me." "Right, madam. Shep," said Webb. "Okay," said Shepherd. "Let's go and see what we've got." They walked over to the other people. On the beach was the body of a young woman wearing a dark blue skirt, a white blouse, and a short red jacket. She had a pretty face and short blonde hair. The back of her head was dark with blood. A man in white clothes was down on one knee looking at the body. He heard Shepard arrived and looked up. "Morning, Shep," he said. "Dr. Atkinson," replied Shep. Atkinson stood up and took the plastic gloves off his hands. "It's murder," he said. "Someone hit her on the back of the head. It killed her." "Hit her with what?" Shepard asked. "I don't know at the moment," answered Atkinson. He looked up and down the beach. "But it could still be here on the beach. Not a stone, I don't think. Something longer. A piece of wood, maybe." Shepard looked up and down the beach. There were lots of bits of wood, brought in by the sea. "What time did she die?" Shepard asked. "Late last night or early this morning," replied Atkinson. "Say between 11 and 2. I can probably tell you more later." "Okay, thanks," said Shepard. She said nothing for a moment and just looked out to sea. Her head was feeling better already. 3 aspirins and a dead body, a quick way to make a headache go away. Not funny, really. Not for the poor woman dead on the beach. "Excuse me, I mean Shep," said Webb. Shepard looked at him. Webb moved uncomfortably from one foot to the other. He was a bit like a young dog, wanting to please her all the time. "The man who found her, the body," began Webb. "He's a waiter at the Grand Hotel and he thinks she was staying there. Well, actually, he's quite sure she was staying there." "And where is he now?" Shepard asked. He's at the hotel," replied Webb. "He had to go to work." "What?" said Shepard, giving Webb an angry look. "Well, he was late already," replied Webb. "And what if I want to speak to him?" Shepard asked. "Now?" "Well," Webb looked more uncomfortable. "I can always." "No," said Shepard. "Later. First, I want you to get as many officers as you can down here on the beach. They're looking for the piece of wood or some other thing that killed this woman." "Right, Shep," replied Webb. Shepard turned to Dr. Atkinson. "Let the photographer finish his work, then you can take the body away," she said. "Okay, Shep," replied Atkinson. Shepard walked back up the beach and sat on the top of the seawall, enjoying the smell of the sea air. She looked in her bag for some cigarettes, then remembered she didn't smoke anymore. 3 weeks without a cigarette? Not bad. She watched Webb finish his call. He must be one of these university police officers, she thought. They leave university, become a police officer, then a sergeant by the age of 25, and know little about real police work. Webb walked up the beach to Shepard. "Have you worked on many murders before, Sergeant?" Shepard asked. "No, Shep," he replied. "Not many. Well, not any really." So, thought Shepard, this could be a difficult job for Webb, his first murder. "The first 24 hours are the most important," said Shepard. "Don't forget that." "Yes, no, I won't," replied Webb. "I want the person who did this," said Shepard. "And I want him or her by this time tomorrow. After that, our job starts to get more difficult." "Right, Shep," said Webb. "Now," said Shepard, "you go to the Grand Hotel. Talk to the waiter who found the body. Find out who the dead woman is and what she was doing here. And get us a room where we can talk to people." "Okay, Shep," said Webb. "I'm going over the road for some breakfast," said Shepard, looking at the Seaview Cafe. "I'll see you at the hotel in half an hour." Webb watched Shepard walk over to the cafe. She wants the job done quickly, he thought to himself. But first she wants breakfast. This could be a long and difficult day. Chapter 2. McNabb Music International. 25 minutes later, Shepard walked through the front doors of the Grand Hotel. She felt much better after a bacon sandwich and a cup of coffee. It was 8 o'clock, and Webb was waiting for her. There were a number of comfortable sofas and chairs near the front desk, but at this time in the morning, not many people were around. "I've got us a room," said Webb, leading the way to the back of the hotel. "It's the Wells Room, named after H.G. Wells, the famous writer. Did you know that he lived near here, between Hythe and Folkestone?" "No," said Shepard, her voice disinterested. Soon they came to a door with the word Wells on it. Webb opened the door. "It's not a very large room," he said. "The hotel uses it for small meetings and parties." "It's fine," said Shepard, looking around. There was a table in the center of the room and 4 chairs down each side of the table. Shepard took a chair and waved a hand for Webb to sit down too. "Okay," she said. "What have you got?" "The dead woman is Claudia Engel," said Webb. He took a piece of paper from inside his jacket and looked at it. "She's German, but she lived in London. She was here with 3 other people from a company called MMI, McNabb Music International. They're a music company from London. They use the hotel for meetings from time to time." "Who are the others?" asked Shepard. Webb looked down at his piece of paper again. "James McNabb. It's his company. Then there's Ajit Chowdhury and Harriet Johnson." Just then the door opened. A man came into the room and stopped. He was tall, in his early 40s, clean-shaven and good-looking. He was well-dressed, expensive dark gray suit, clean white shirt and red tie. Shepard could almost smell the money. The man looked at Webb, then at Shepard. "I'm James McNabb," he said to Shepard. "Your sergeant said you wanted to see me." His voice was rather high for a tall man. I asked him why, but he said he couldn't tell me. Shepard got the feeling that this was a man who liked to be the boss. He certainly didn't mind walking into a room without knocking first. "Well, what's the problem?" said McNabb, looking at his watch. "I've got a meeting at 9 o'clock and a lot to do before it." With Webb so new to the job, Shepard couldn't see him asking many questions. She looked at McNabb and tried to decide how to begin. "I'd like him to feel less sure of himself from the beginning," she thought. "Does Claudia Engel work for you?" Shepard asked. "Yes, she does," replied McNabb. "And?" "I'm afraid I've got some bad news," said Shepard. "We found a body on the beach this morning. We believe it is Claudia Engel. We also believe that someone murdered her." "What?" McNabb's mouth fell open. "Claudia? I don't believe it. It can't be true." "I'm afraid it is," said Shepard. "That's terrible," said McNabb. "Terrible." "I need to ask you some questions," said Shepard. "Take a seat." "Well," said McNabb, looking at his watch again. "Of course, I'll do what I can to help." He pulled out a chair and sat down. "Tell me why you're here in Hythe," said Shepard. McNabb took a moment to think. He looked at Webb and then at Shepard. 2 or 3 times a year we come here for a day or 2, he began. "Our offices are in London, but it's sometimes easier to work without the phone going every 5 minutes. We come here to get away and talk about important business." "What important business?" asked Shepard. McNabb moved on his chair. "Why do you want to know?" he asked. "I don't like to tell people too much about our business." "Do you need to know this?" Shepard put both hands on the table and sat up. "Mr. McNabb," she said quietly, a hard look in her eyes. "We're talking about a murder. I'm going to ask any question I want, and you're going to answer it." McNabb put both hands up in front of him, as if keeping Shepard away. Okay, he said. "I was only asking." Shepard sat back. McNabb put his hands down and started speaking again. "MMI is a music company. We make and sell CDs. We sell music over the internet. We work with musicians. Anything to do with music, we do it. Like I say, we're in the music business." "So, what did you come here to talk about?" Shepard asked. "We had to decide a number of things," replied McNabb, but said no more. Shepard looked at him. "Mr. McNabb," she said angrily, "this is going to be much easier if you help me. What things did you have to decide?" "We have some new bands we're interested in. We wanted to talk about them," answered McNabb, not looking at Shepard. "Two of them are very good, and I wanted to talk to the others about where the company is going over the next few years." "Tell me about the other people who work for you," said Shepard. McNabb looked happier now. He was talking about the people in the company and not company business. "Well, there's Ajit Chowdhury," said McNabb. "He's the money man, the company accountant. Harriet Johnson looks after sales. She sells MMI's music all around the world. And then Claudia looked after the music side of things, the music itself, and the musicians and the bands." "And how does everyone get on?" asked Shepard. McNabb thought for a moment. "I think we get on well," he said. "Of course, we don't always agree with each other, but we're always adults about it. Nobody takes their ball home and says they don't want to play anymore, if you see what I mean." McNabb smiled. Shepard didn't smile back. "Tell us about last night," she said. "There's not much to tell," answered McNabb. "We worked until about 5. Then we met in the bar, sometime between 7 and 7:30. We had dinner together in the restaurant and finished about 9:30. Then we went our different ways. I went to my room and watched TV for half an hour. Then I had a shower and went to bed." Shepard looked at Webb to see if he had any questions. "Did anything unusual happen yesterday evening?" he asked. Good question, Shepard thought. Maybe there's more to Webb than I thought. "No," began McNabb, but then he stopped and thought. Actually, yes, there was something strange. Webb didn't say anything. He just waited for McNabb to speak again. "When we were in the bar," said McNabb, "a man came in. As soon as he saw Claudia, he turned around and walked out again. But she saw him. It was very strange. Her face turned white. For a moment, she looked terrible. We asked her if she was okay. She said yes, she was fine. She said it was just someone she once knew." "What did the man look like?" asked Webb. "I really don't remember," said McNabb. "Fair hair, not tall, not short, nothing unusual. I only saw him for a few seconds." Shepard felt it was important to find out more about this man and decided to end the conversation, but McNabb was speaking again. "Inspector," he said, "I hope you find this man soon. I'm sure the news of Claudia's murder will be in the newspapers, but I'd like to keep MMI away from this kind of news as much as I can." Shepherd smiled to herself. McNabb, the boss, was looking after his company again. "It'll take as long as it takes, Mr. McNabb," she said. "I'll probably want to talk to you again after we've spoken to Ms. Johnson and Mr. Chowdhury. I'll also want my officers to look around all your hotel rooms. You can go now, but don't leave the hotel." McNabb opened his mouth to say something, but then he saw the look in Shepherd's eye. He closed his mouth, looked at Webb, then back at Shepherd. "Right," he said. "Thank you," said Shepherd. McNabb left the room, closing the door behind him. Shepherd turned to Webb. "With people like McNabb, you've got to let them know who's the boss," she said. "It's us, the police, not them. Don't forget that." "Right, Shep," replied Webb. "Now," said Shepherd. "Harriet Johnson next. But before that, we need to know more about that man who came into the bar last night. Get someone to ask around the hotel. Did anyone see a man, our Mr. X, come into the hotel between 7 and 7:30, go into the bar and then leave quickly? If so, who is he? I also want to know when Claudia Engel left the hotel. And was anyone with her?" "Okay," said Webb. He stood up. "And we need a look at these people's rooms," said Shepherd. "Engel's room and the other 3. 2 officers to each room. If they find anything strange or unusual, I want to know." "Right, Shep," said Webb, going to the door. "And, Sergeant?" said Shepherd. "Yes," said Webb. Shepherd looked at her watch. It was too early for a glass of wine. "Get someone to bring us some coffee." Chapter 3. Questions for Ms. Johnson. Harriet Johnson was wearing black jeans and a pink blouse. She had long dark hair and looked very sure of herself. She sat down in front of Shepherd and Webb. "James told me the news," she said. "I understand you want to talk to me." "Yes," said Shepherd slowly, giving Johnson a long look. "How well did you know Miss Engel?" "Well enough," replied Johnson. "We worked together for 2 years." Shepherd gave her another long look. Something was wrong. "You don't look sad," said Shepherd. Johnson gave a short laugh. "No, I don't. I do," she said. Her mouth smiled, but not her eyes. "Well, I didn't like Claudia Engel at all. Actually, I hated her." Shepherd looked questioningly at Johnson. "The old story," said Johnson, again with a short laugh. "I had a boyfriend. She took him away from me. They started going out while I thought he and I were still together. Then I found out what was happening. He left me for her. Well, I told him not to come back, actually. Then later she left him." "I see," said Shepherd. "She made me very unhappy. Then she made my boyfriend unhappy. Mind you, he never really knew what he wanted anyway. This all happened 2 years ago, when she started at MMI. It all meant nothing to her. But it didn't mean anything to me." "And you hated her," said Shepherd. "I did," said Johnson. "I probably still do." "Yes," Shepherd thought. "You do." She could almost feel the hate coming across from the other side of the table. "But I didn't kill her," said Johnson. "How did the others feel about Engel?" asked Shepherd. "McNabb, Chowdhury." Johnson smiled again. "They didn't like her much," she answered. "Ajit Chowdhury wanted her job. Okay, he's the accountant, but he thinks he knows a lot about music. He doesn't want to sit in an office all day. He wants to be out and about with famous musicians." "And McNabb?" asked Shepherd. "Dear old James," answered Johnson. "He likes everyone to think he's the boss, doesn't he? But actually, well, he's just a little bit afraid of women. You probably saw that, Inspector." For a moment Shepherd thought about smiling, but decided against the idea. Anyway, Johnson was speaking again, he was certainly afraid of Claudia. Over the last 2 years, she was the real brains behind the company. The musicians loved her. She knew what music the public wanted to buy, and James knew he just had to agree to her ideas. "How long have you worked for MMI?" asked Shepherd. 15 years, answered Johnson, "since James started the company." "And the company is doing well?" asked Shepherd. "Fine," replied Johnson quickly. Too quickly, maybe, Shepherd thought. "Some of our musicians are big names all over the world," said Johnson. "And we're taking on 2 new bands. I haven't heard them, but people say they're excellent." "Tell us about last night," said Shepherd. Johnson told Webb and Shepherd about the 4 of them having drinks in the bar. "Then we had dinner," said Johnson. "We finished about 9:30. McNabb told us about a man who came into the bar, someone Claudia Engel knew," said Shepherd. "You haven't told us about him." "I didn't see him," replied Johnson. "I had my back to the door, and by the time I turned around, he was gone." "But you're sure Miss Engel knew him?" Shepherd made it a question. "Oh, yes," said Johnson. "The look on her face told me that. Actually, I think she met him later. She certainly met someone." Shepherd looked questioningly at Johnson. "After dinner, I sat in the lounge, had a coffee and read a book," began Johnson. "While I was there, Claudia came down from her room and went out of the front doors. From where I was sitting, I could see through the doors. They're glass. And she was standing there. Outside. Waiting. I'm sure she was waiting for someone. Then she walked away to the left. It was as if she could see the person she was meeting." "Why did you think that?" Shepherd asked. "Just the way she was walking," said Johnson. "But you didn't see the person she was meeting?" asked Shepherd. "No," said Johnson. "It was too dark." "What time was this?" Shepherd asked. "Probably about 10:30, answered Johnson. "Maybe 10:45. I went up to my room soon after that." She moved uncomfortably on her chair. "And you didn't see Miss Engel again?" asked Shepherd. "No," replied Johnson. Shepherd looked at Webb. "There's salt on your shoes," he said to Johnson. "What do you mean?" asked Johnson. "They're white round the bottoms," said Webb. "That's salt. From the sea. Have you been on the beach?" Shepherd looked at Johnson's shoes. They were black trainers, and there was salt round the bottom of them. "Not bad, Webb," she thought. "Well, I went for a walk on the beach yesterday afternoon," replied Johnson. "Yesterday afternoon?" Webb made it a question. "Yes," replied Johnson. "You didn't go out again in the evening? After 10:30, perhaps?" asked Webb. "No," answered Johnson, her voice not as strong as before. "I've told you." "I went up to my room." Webb said nothing. He just looked at Johnson. Shepherd could see Johnson's face starting to go a little red. Maybe there was something she didn't want the police to know. Johnson moved uncomfortably on her chair again. "I've told you," she said again. "I went up to my room." Webb looked at Shepherd. "Okay, Miss Johnson," said Shepherd. You can go. We'll want to talk to you again, so don't leave the hotel, okay?" "Right," said Johnson quietly, and she left the room, head down. Shepard and Webb looked at each other. "She wasn't very happy about something, was she?" said Shepard. "There's something she's not telling us," answered Webb. "Or maybe she just didn't like my questions." Shepard stood up. "I need some air," she said, taking her bag off the back of the chair. "And I've got a call to make. Go and see if there is any news about our Mr. X or from the officers in the rooms. I'll be outside the front of the hotel." 15 minutes later, Shepard was standing outside the front doors of the hotel. Her phone was in her hand. Webb came out of the hotel at a fast walk. He had a piece of paper in his hand. "Two things, Shep," he said. Shepard closed her phone. "Well?" she asked. "We know who Mr. X is," said Webb, looking pleased with himself. "And one of the receptionists agrees with Johnson that Engel left the hotel at 10:30. But she also saw Chowdhury leaving the hotel at about 10:45. Chapter 4. How well is MMI doing? Shepard waited for Webb to say more, but he didn't. He probably wants me to say, "Well done," she thought. "Come on, don't just stand there, tell me," she said. Webb looked uncomfortable. His face went a little red. He looked at the piece of paper in his hand. "Well, the man's called Darren Fleming. We talked to some of the people who work in the bar. He comes into the hotel for a drink from time to time. He lives in Hythe somewhere. We're trying to find him now." "Right," said Shepard. "When you do, bring him here. What about Chowdhury?" Webb looked at the paper in his hand again. "Do you always write things down?" Shepard asked. "Do you have problems remembering?" "No, Shep," said Webb, smiling a little, but still looking rather uncomfortable. He waved the paper at her. "Someone gave me this. Detective Constable Fox, I think his name is." All right," said Shepard. She preferred not to think about D.C. Fox. Fox loved writing everything down, putting everything in the right place, doing everything just right. Not Shepard's sort of person at all. "I know he's a lot older than you," said Shepard, "but don't take too many lessons from Fox." "I'll try not to," replied Webb. For a moment, Webb thought he saw the beginning of a smile on Shepard's face, but then it was gone. "The receptionist remembered Chowdhury leaving the hotel at about 10:45 last night," said Webb. "He was dressed in running clothes." Shepard thought for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Get Ajit Chowdhury. We'll have a talk with him next." She put her phone away in her bag. "I've just been on the phone to a friend of mine in London," she told Webb. "She told me some interesting things about MMI. I hope the company accountant has some good answers." 20 minutes later, Chowdhury was sitting in the Wells room in front of Shepard and Webb. It was 10:30. Chowdhury was a tall, good-looking man in his early 30s. He had on a dark brown suit, cream shirt, and light brown tie. His fingers were playing with the front of his jacket. His eyes were looking from Shepard to Webb and back again. Softly, softly, Shepard thought. Don't make him uncomfortable, or he won't say anything. Start with some easy questions. "Tell us about your job, Mr. Chowdhury," she began. Chowdhury sat back in the chair and stopped playing with his jacket. "I'm the company accountant. I look after the money," he answered, smiling a little. "So I understand," said Shepard. "And is it a good job?" A good company to work for? Well, yes, I think so, he replied. Do you all like each other? I mean, do you work well together? Shepard asked. We aren't all great friends, he replied. But we work well together. Yes. Claudia Engel too? Shepard asked quietly. Chowdhury looked away to one side for a moment, then back at Shepard. She could be rather difficult, he said. Tell me about it, said Shepard. Believe me, I know all about working with difficult people. Chowdhury gave her a small smile. She was a hard woman, he began. She knew what she wanted, she knew how to get it, and she didn't allow anybody to get in her way. I understand you know quite a bit about music, said Shepard, as well as money. Yes, replied Chowdhury. But Claudia never listened to what I thought. I spend a lot of time in clubs. I've seen a lot of good new bands, but she always knew best. There was something strange in Chowdhury's voice that made Shepard ask her next question. Were you lovers? She asked. Webb quickly turned to look at Shepard. There was fire in Chowdhury's eyes. It's nothing to do with, he started. It's murder, said Shepard, her voice hard before Chowdhury could finish. Chowdhury's head went down. Then he looked at her again. We slept together once, he said, an angry look in his eyes. And then she said that was it. It was over, finished. And that made you angry, said Shepard. It wasn't a question. It still does, said Chowdhury, but not enough to kill her. It hurt me at the time, but it was just one night. And she didn't tell everyone about it. No one in the office knew.